Girira Gamali, into Ganarina Bajara. Malagamindo, Nanya Barely, Nanya Bayami. On behalf of the Turrbal and Yagara people, traditional owners of the land that you sit upon today, we have walked this land for millennia, and with time comes knowledge. We have studied the stars, the trees, the animals, the seas, the land. Our knowledge is a collection of thoughts, memories, and experiences of our forefathers and foremothers, handed down from generation to generation. It makes us who we are. We're here today at the Australian Catholic University, a great place of learning and knowledge. And on behalf of the Turrbal and Yagara people, I would like to extend a warm welcome to you all.
In my language, I'd like to say, Yura. Welcome to this wonderful gathering here. I've come across these to come here from Stradbroke Island. I'm a fourth generation descendant of my apical ancestor, and that is where my guidance follows me and keeps me on the straight and narrow of holistic well-being. I'd just like us to think about this year's focus, voice, treaty, the truth. And it's time for us to think seriously about that. Really important. And I'd also like to link that back to the 2016 reconciliation focus. And that was about the importance of story. We have a keen focus in this country to have an authentic, multicultural Australian society. But until we get the First Nations people's story there up front in the circle of the multiculturalism, we will not have authentic multiculturalism. And the church will not be the church that Jesus meant it to be until we, the First Nations of Australia, have made our contribution to that church, and it has been joyfully accepted by others. And I give thanks to ACU. It's just 30 years since my involvement with ACU in part-time lecturing, and that I signed off 2 years ago. I'm 83 years, had a very bad setback, 6 months, but I'm still here. So thank you very much for inviting me, and I say on behalf of the Quandamooka people, the First Nations in South East Queensland were determined as with native title as their traditional land owners. We don't believe we own land, we believe that we are caretakers of the land. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the panel discussion tonight. Have a lovely evening.
Creation, you have given us the beautiful land we call Australia, rich in ancient culture and tradition, rich in landscape, plants, and animal life, rich in resources, laws, and social structure, offering safety and opportunity. Teach us to see who we are at our gates, to act justly so that all may come to the table, and to weep for those who perish before they have been invited. Where there is hunger in our world, may we share our food and our resources, and contribute our skills and knowledge to create a sustainable food supply. Where there is disaster, may we respond quickly and generously to bring relief to those injured and deprived of homes, and help them to rebuild their lives and their communities. Where there are people who are disabled, may we see them first as people, and work tirelessly to ensure they are always included and have the resources to reach their full potential. Where people are displaced from their own lands, especially those who seek refuge on our shores, may we dare to put ourselves in their shoes and welcome them to share in the life gifted to us. Where Indigenous communities are displaced in their own land, may we acknowledge the wrongs of the past and recognise the richness of their culture, and empower all Indigenous peoples to determine their own future. God of all creation, give us clear eyes to see the whole world, so that we may never take for granted the gifts you have given or think they belong to us alone. Give us open hearts to reach out from our comfort and open the gates, and to walk in new solidarity with all our neighbours. Amen.
You a yarn before the end of the evening, and I'm delighted to say that we've arrived at our panel discussion event, being Solidarity, Closing the Gap Together. By way of a brief recap, in his Social Justice Report 2005, former Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner Tom Calma, AO, urged Australian governments to commit to achieving equality for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in health and life expectancy within 25 years. In 2008, Australian governments committed to specific targets for reducing inequalities in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander life expectancy, mortality, education, and employment. A seventh target to close the gap in school attendance was added in 2014. In December 2016, the Council of Australian Governments, COAG, agreed to refresh the Closing the Gap agenda ahead of the 10th anniversary of the agreement and 4 of the 7 targets expiring in 2018. In 2017, the Uluru Statement from the Heart was signed at a landmark meeting of Indigenous representatives from around the country, separate to the Closing the Gap campaign, but clearly interrelated. And it is here where we begin our conversation this evening with the landmark Uluru Statement from the Heart, which is itself a testament to solidarity in that it is addressed to the entire Australian people, not just the Australian Parliament. We have an outstanding panel with us this evening. I'm very grateful to all of them, and I do apologise for my introductions being brief, but you have a fuller biography, I guess, for each panelist on your table in the programmes. But in the interest of time, let me introduce our panel and welcome the Most Reverend Archbishop Mark Coleridge, Archbishop of Brisbane, of course, Dr. Doseena Fergie OAM, Project Lead for the Building Cultural Capacity at the Australian Catholic University, Professor Greg Craven, AO, GCSG, Vice-Chancellor and President of the Australian Catholic University and renowned constitutional lawyer, Mr. Selwyn Button, Registrar, Office of the Registrar of Indigenous Corporations, and my thanks to Mr. Richie Ahmat, co-chair of the Cape York Partnership Group and a member of the Prime Minister's Indigenous Advisory Council, Cape York Partnership Group. Your Grace, if I can start with you, the Uluru Statement from the Heart invites the entire Australian community to come together in a shared journey. I think it was the Irish historian Benedict Anderson who said, "Communities are often imagined, but are felt as real." And in this setting, one is reminded by the very real feeling of solidarity expressed by Pope John Paul II when he gave his historic and in no small part spiritual speech to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples gathered in Alice Springs now some 30 years ago. The question is, how should we understand the virtue of solidarity? And does this enable a greater understanding of the spiritual dimension of our nation's first people?
Solidarity can be understood in 1,000 different ways, but here tonight I think our focus is upon solidarity within the context of closing the gap. And it strikes me when we talk that language of closing the gap, what do we actually mean by it? It's not a bad phrase, but it can mean all kinds of things. I think we, and when I say we, I mean people like me who are white, basically of European background, born here, have had comparatively little to do with Indigenous Australians over the years, that we tend to think that they've got to catch up with us. And that's what it doesn't mean in this context. Somehow we have to move beyond, and when I say we, people like me, and perhaps also Indigenous people who can imbibe without realising it, this kind of Western mentality, that we're a lot further down the track than the Indigenous, and they really have to catch up to us if the gap is going to be closed. So that has to go. In a sense, I think people like me have to be able to say, we have to catch up with you. And this touches upon the question of spirituality, if I could call it that. Mind you, I'm not sure that Indigenous peoples know what we're talking about when we talk about spirituality. Because one of the things I'm coming to see is that their understanding of the distinction between the sacred and the profane is completely different from the kinds of things I take for granted. They don't see a distinction between sacred and profane. That's distinctively Western. Now, for years I've been grappling with the seemingly intractable question of Indigenous Australia, because through my adult life I've come to think that it's the running sore at the heart of the nation. Joan said in her Welcome to Country that the church will never be the church that Jesus wants until we have fully embraced our Indigenous brothers and sisters. That is certainly true. So it's a running sore at the heart of the church in Australia, but it's a running sore at the heart of the nation. And what I've seen through my adult life is we've tried all sorts of things. I don't think there's a lack of goodwill, at least in the overt sense. I think there is also an undercurrent, as it were, of racism, the kind of racism that we've heard speak of here this evening. But everything we've tried, including the Closing the Gap initiative, has not really helped. If anything, it's made things worse. Now, I came from Melbourne, and I'm not sure that I had anything much to do with the Indigenous down there, but my life has been a journey northwards. I came to Canberra and I struck the Indigenous reality there much more, and I've come now to Brisbane, and being in Queensland, I have struck the Indigenous reality in a way that I have never struck it before and that I can't evade. It's everywhere in this part of the world. So the questions I've been asking have become more pressing, but it was really a long and complex and at times very moving discussion at the Bishops' meeting last May about the crisis of Indigenous communities in Australia that really did focus me in another way. The discussion was led by people like the Bishop of Broome, the Bishop of Wilcannia Falls, the Bishop of Darwin. These are guys who are dealing with all the shocking stuff that's going on in our Indigenous communities from day to day. And the stories they tell are soul-searing. Now, that discussion made me see that there's a piece of the puzzle that's missing, and it's always been missing. And how would I describe the piece of the puzzle? Well, in my language, it would be the spiritual. Because a lot of the deepest problems faced by the Indigenous are, in my reading of things, spiritual at their core. But I don't think we have begun to take Indigenous spirituality seriously, or even begun to understand it. And until we do, politics are important, but they won't do it. Legal aspects are very important, but not enough. Funding is very important, but it's not enough. The missing piece of the puzzle, and in a sense it's the key piece, is the spiritual. Now, you know, you hear words like Dadiri that Miriam Rose has given us, and Bishop Chris Saunders talks about Li Yan, and a guy I was at school with has just done a very interesting doctoral thesis on this notion. It's not a notion, it's this reality called Alt Yere from Central Australian Indigenous communities. And you get the words, but you don't know what they're talking about because the language they're talking is completely different. They don't see the distinction between sacred and profane. They don't see the distinctions as we do between the divine and the human and the natural. It's all part of in other words, it's not a binary sense of things at all. It is profoundly unitary in a way that the Western mind can't cope with. Now, this ought to be the thing the church is best at, but we've been hopeless. You can't expect a government of any kind to address the spiritual. And yet, unless we do that, I think we are going to be faced with a running sword that just keeps running. So I think there's a huge task for the church in this area of Indigenous spiritualities. And I also think, therefore, that there's a huge task for an institution like ACU.
Thank you, Grace. And Doseena, that link between the spiritual and the material, is that something that resonates with you? And are there, I know the Uluru Statement from the Heart does talk about structural reform. Are there positive examples that you've come across in structural reform that links the two?
Well, you know, Jim, I was just going to attack. What do we mean by the church? You just answered it. It is not a white church we are looking at. Solidarity won't happen unless there are two things, power and money. When that is overturned, who has the power and who has the control over the money? When I went and did my field work, I'm sorry I'm getting away from this, but I think I'm storying, okay? My PhD thesis was when I went to see two rivers, the Murray and the Darling River, meeting, and at that point they met and they continued on as the Murray. The Darling River came down, it was light in colour, meeting the Murray River, and there was a distinct line. Look, we are just two different cultures, two different worldviews, and yes, our spirituality is different. But what that metaphor, that analogy showed me is that we can come and be transformed and walk together. I am not expected to be a white person. In many ways, I've become assimilated in our education system. Brother over here, he's my relative, by the way, and so I would like to pay my respects to him. It's lovely to see him, Richard. He's actually my uncle, and I brought my brother as well. What I'm saying is that the way we look at things is just so different. Sister girl Cherise brought it right out there. Solidarity can't happen until racism, when people look at what is white privilege, racism and discrimination is actually attacked. Until we self-reflect on it. And then we can find from there that our places are not culturally safe. They're not culturally appropriate. And yes, there are deficits, but boy, we've got some really good stuff happening in the community. And I'm really tired of hearing the deficits, but I want to hear the good stuff, don't we? Yes. And when we hear the good stuff, then it might sort of get the balance right. And throw that Close the Gap book out the window. And just concentrate on the good stuff that's happening out.
Am I right in thinking that some of that good stuff, Doseena, you've been involved in with ACU about creating those culturally safe spaces? Exactly.
And I think ACU is in a good place here. My colleague and I, and he was supposed to wolf whistle me as I came up. His name's Philip Price. And we are trying to build cultural capacity in our curriculum by embedding Indigenous perspectives in all our curriculum. Why? Because, one, we want our staff to have really good resources that are true, that they have the fact of the Black history. And we have thus found that there are a lot of resources that our staff are using that don't reach that calibre. So we're trying to change that. And why? So that our students can go out and know that there are challenges out there and they're better able to work with our people. Why? So that our people can access the services. Why don't our people come in? Because it's not safe. Why am I a black woman up here? We are the lowest in the hierarchy, sorry Jim, hierarchy, and I've got 4 guys. So if you are going to get us to present, make sure there's another woman up here, because I had to ask my brother to come on down because I feel safe. And I knew Rich would be here. I really feel safe.
Make sure we amend that for next year, I promise.
Yeah, so I haven't answered, but I've just gone on.
Thank you, Doseena. What we did do this year, though, was get a young guy on the panel, Selwyn, which is terrific. And Selwyn, I have to say that there are good examples where those 2 rivers become one, and Doseena's mentioned one of them. But clearly, the Closing the Gap report, as was mentioned, I guess, by the Archbishop, shows that the status quo is clearly unjust in the lived experiences of our First Peoples. What could we learn from the Closing the Gap campaign, and how might this inform its next phase?
Thanks, Jim. Before I start, I want to make sure my daughter actually heard me call me young. Can I also acknowledge 2 significant elders in the room and have had an impact on my life? Aunty Joan Hendriks, who gave the welcome, and Aunty Ruth Hegarty. I'm not sure where you sit. Very important for me to acknowledge the fact that Aunty Ruth's in the room, because she's actually an elder from my language group, the Gungri people from South West Queensland. So good to see you here. Closing the entire Closing the Gap campaign, I guess, certainly from my experience, being in government, being in a non-government organisation, working in Aboriginal medical services, and now back in government, working in the Commonwealth, I guess there were a couple of things that I saw from the get-go that were some flaws in the process. the first flaw in the process when it started off, and the 6 targets were formed, is that the 6 targets were actually constituted by government. There was no conversation with community from the beginning. It was coming up with 6 targets, saying here are the 6 targets, and government sets the agenda around the 6 targets, but we're not going to consult with anyone. We're just going to say that that's the focus and that's what it's going to be. So that for me was already a flaw, and certainly that is the reason why when you wander around community and you talk to people, particularly Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, about their investment and their responsibility and their accountability about the Close the Gap targets, they'll shy away from it because they weren't involved in the setting of the agenda in the first place. It was someone else that did it for them. So again, we have this policy in the Zone where it's about things that are done to us as opposed to things that are done with us. The second piece in the puzzle is then the conversation that exists and I'm a public servant, so I see this sort of stuff all the time. The conversation that exists in terms of bilateral discussions between state and territory governments. The 6 Close the Gaps targets that then became 7 later on were set by the Commonwealth Government and imposed by the Commonwealth Government on state and territory governments. Now that doesn't sit well. We all see how politics plays out in terms of how government relationships work and how there's always going to be the fighting, irrespective of whether or not you're from the same party. There's still going to be disputes in relation to when Commonwealth sets an agenda and what the state has to do to commit to making sure that they can meet that agenda. So when you're sitting at a table and having a discussion about what it looks like in terms of your obligations to meet the 6 Close the Gap targets, and you weren't involved in setting them, not just community, but government to government, then it's going to create some friction. So they're not wanting to then play the game. Even though there's resources that come with it to flow, they're not setting the agenda around what that looks like. The third part of it is then about the ongoing nature of it. Whilst we've had more than 10 years now of Close the Gap targets, implementation of initiatives around the place, we're still stuck and we're still wedded to national, reporting regimes. We're not thinking about how do you start to divest it down to a state base, to a regional base, and to a local community base, where communities are actually involved in saying, okay, well, if that's the 6 targets, what are our priorities? What's the priorities for Cave York in relation to 6 Close the Gap targets? What are we going to do to set the agenda for our own community? And how are we going to report and how we're going to be involved in the conversations to not only set the agenda and set the KPIs, if you like, but also what are we going to take responsibility for if it fails? So there are 3 significant pieces that have been flaws throughout the process that hopefully now we've got, a coalition of people sitting at the table with the Prime Minister. There's a bit more hope in the sense that it might actually start to get some traction to say, let's create some shared ownership. Shared ownership starts at a national level, and now how do we cascade that down to jurisdictional and to local community level, so everyone's actually got skin in the game. People aren't going to do the work if they don't have skin.
Selwyn, I think the Prime Minister did mention that what was missing was a true partnership. That idea of consultation was missing. Vice Chancellor, I guess the Uluru Statement from the Heart calls for a First Nations voice to be enshrined in the Constitution. However, Ken Wyatt has cautioned that the journey will not be easy. In fact, 44 referenda, only 8 have been successful. From your point of view, how can we ensure that the forthcoming journey is one of solidarity rather than division, and one that positively impacts the parliamentary system?
Well, to be sort of slightly divisive in the cause of solidarity, I think the first thing we have to do to make that journey successful is to stop, or at least to call out lies when they're told about the Indigenous voice. And I think the great lie, the great tagline that we've all heard is that it's the third chamber and it should be rejected. It's a third house of Parliament. Now, I am a constitutional lawyer. We're not the funnest people in the world, but we do know what we know. And a parliamentary chamber is something that can initiate, stop and pass laws. Now, the Indigenous voice cannot initiate laws, it cannot stop laws, it cannot pass laws. All it can do is talk. And in that sense, it's entirely consistent with the Australian Constitution. It was designed to be entirely consistent with the Australian Constitution. The legislative body we have in the Australian Constitution is what is called a parlement, a thing that talks. So what possible harm can be done by there being a voice that balances, informs, or enriches that national voice? Now, I think I've been thinking a lot about this, and there have been some very good things that have happened in the last 2 weeks. You all have seen that Murray Gleeson, the former Chief Justice, came out in favour of the voice. Bob French, the next Chief Justice, came out in favour of the voice. Barnaby Joyce, I pay tribute to him, came out and said I was wrong to call the third chamber. But it's still the case, I think, that Mr Morrison clings to that tag, and it's a disabling tag, and it's used for that purpose. And I was talking to Richie about this. I've been trying to figure out, because I am a constitutional conservative, and I was involved with Aunty from the University of Sydney and the original design, and we have all the constitutional courage of a slug. So it's quite hard for us to see that this is radical. I was thinking, why are people afraid of this? And if you talk to them, they'll say, oh, it'll all go wrong. It'll all be a disaster. It'll be a contentious clanging of gongs and a wreck and a train wreck, and it'll be all of these terrible things. Having thought about it, I think it's the exact opposite. I think they're really, really worried that it's going to work. I think that they're concerned that you will have a voice of such dignity and such authority and such persuasiveness that it will make Parliament pause and think. And that is something people in the very privileged position of Parliament are going to find very, very worrying. It might even be the case that if people were to take school children, you know how we take school children to question time in Parliament, they sit there crying in the gallery saying, please Daddy, make them stop, make them stop. It may even be that the Indigenous voice, when it is in the Constitution, shows Parliament up. So I think that's our challenge. And the only way we can get that is not by appealing to the extreme right or appealing to the extreme left. It's by appealing to the radical heart of the nation, that radical reasonableness that I think does lie at the centre of Australia. I'd suggest the radical reasonableness in this room. But we can't start by letting lies go past. So that would be the first thing I'd say.
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor. Richie, can I invite you to share with us your view of an Indigenous voice to Parliament, that notion, that idea?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. 2 years ago, just over 200 blackfellas, First Nations people, met in Alice Springs at Uluru. The theme of this conference is solidarity. But when you get over 200 Indigenous people in a room from right across the nation, if you don't agree, you could have a master fight outside of the conference room, because blackfellas are like that. We're so committed to our territories. I think to get that group of people to come out with the one united voice, the one united voice for an Indigenous voice to Parliament, and the change in the Constitution for us to be recognised. At the present moment, there is not one thing in the Australian Constitution that says Indigenous person. Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, there is zero in our Constitution, zero. So, I think it is scaremongering the day after the statement from the heart came out. I think Barnaby came out and he scaremongered every single Australian, black, blue, white, Asian, whatever. We have the biggest multicultural nation in the world. I think then things went pear-shaped for us because it was fear. It's like Greg's saying. There was fear in the hearts of politicians. And I said to Greg, just imagine
if we could go back, the day after the statement from the heart, and the PM then was Malcolm Turnbull. If Turnbull would have said, as the highest voice in this land, if Turnbull would have said, this is going to be hard for the Australian people. This is going to be really hard for us to go to a referendum to change the constitution of this country and to allow an Indigenous voice. But as the PM, I am going to give this my best shot. If the PM would have said that 2 years ago, the people who were sitting on the fence would have walked over the fence and followed him. And we wouldn't be having this discussion, because I think we would have had our referendum, and I think legislation would have come into it. I just can't believe, the fear that is put in the Australian public. We're not going to take away, not one Indigenous person in this room, in the country, is not going to take away any power from anybody, or any politician for that matter, because that's not our right. But yet, governments think they have a right to tell natives what's best for them. I don't say to Greg, I don't say to my brother here, my niece, Archbishop, Jim, I don't have a right to tell anybody except my family what's best for you. I don't. And this is why, if we're not recognized, Indigenous Australia, the First Nations peoples, if we're not recognized in our constitution, so then we can give advice. As Greg said, any policies that come up concerning Indigenous Australia, we don't have a right of veto. We don't. All right? It's just an advisory council that will be elected through probably the Electoral Commission of Australia. That's what we will run through. Everybody, every tourist I meet, every person from overseas, the first thing they want to do, especially from Europe, the first thing they want to do when they get to this country is to meet a black fella. I have phone calls on a daily basis in my office. Where do you think we should go, Mr. Ahmat? We want to see Aboriginal culture. And I tell you what, it is the most promoted issue in this country, Indigenous Australia. Arts, culture, dance, welcome to country. Why ask us to welcome people to country if you don't want to acknowledge us?
It's a very powerful comment, Richie. Thank you very much for that. I think you touch on culture and, in its broadest terms, education. Education makes justice possible. A powerful idea. I think, Selwyn, you've got a background as a qualified teacher. There are many education leaders in the audience here this evening. The question is, how should we reform learning and teaching to address First Peoples' needs and secure positive futures for them?
Good question, Jim. Let's see how we go. Look, the experience that we had, and this was another part of, I guess, the entire process of closing the gap, where we took control of the agenda, certainly within the Queensland government, and working in the education department. Where we took control of the agenda is sequencing. We had 6 targets, we had 6 things to work on from an educational context, or 7, of the 7. 4 of them were focused in one department. So we then had to work out, well, what are we going to do first? We can't do all of them. We can't do all 7. As most people know, if you're setting out more than 5 targets in a strategic plan, you're never going to get them. So we had to scale it back to work out, well, what do we focus on first? And what we focused on first was Year 12 outcomes. The reason why we focused on Year 12 outcomes is because within the data of Queensland schools, we saw that it was absolutely achievable. And there's a couple of reasons why we did that. Not just because it was achievable, but because it was something that could create a life-changing experience for kids. We didn't go to school principals when we were having a conversation about reforming schools to improve outcomes. We didn't go to schools to tell them what to do in the schools. We actually went to principals and had a conversation with principals in schools about what would happen if they did their job, which was making sure that every student in their school successfully completed Year 12. If they did that, what would happen in terms of the social outcomes, not just for an individual person, but for their family and their community. So we talked about that in the sense of really connecting with the hearts and minds of principals in schools to say, you can make a significant difference here just by changing the life trajectory of one student. And if we did that across the entire state, just imagine what that would look like for all of the Queensland Indigenous community. And that's when we saw significant shifts, and we literally closed the gap in Year 12 outcomes in Queensland state schools because of that. So it was a small thing, but again, it was about creating systemic reform. And so that principals took it on board. And again, when you look at any initiative that you're trying to do within schools, what we've done in the past is attempted to focus on a small piece of the puzzle. And the small piece of the puzzle, which is about driving an Indigenous education agenda and trying to utilise the Indigenous staff in schools to create significant change. Now, the Indigenous staff in schools, as many of you guys would know around the place, only make up about 2% of the workforce. So if you're trying to get 2% of the workforce to change the life trajectory of students across 200 odd schools, it's not going to work. So you have to flip the switch and focus our attention on the 90% of the workforce. So focus on the principals and non-Indigenous principals and non-Indigenous teachers and deputies and others and say, how do we get you to actually play your role in supporting our kids? Because if we did that better, then we'd see the systemic reform occur.
Thank you, Selwyn. I mean, Greg, in university terms, are you seeing a similar focus, perhaps a systemic focus by Universities Australia in requiring universities to produce reconciliation action plans?
I think universities are trying very hard at it. I don't think we always succeed at it. I actually think it's often quite hard for us to visualise something in an Indigenous action plan that would actually work for Indigenous people as opposed to work for us. I think that's a challenge. I remember I was Deputy Vice-Chancellor at another university, not a Catholic university, I won't name the university, but I was in charge of what was effectively the Indigenous Action Plan. It was a great plan. It was terrific. Every faculty had signed up to it, every school had signed up to it, everybody was going to do this and everybody was going to do that. And I remember calling a meeting of the deans, and they all came and I said, I want to talk about what we're doing with Indigenous Action. And they said, oh, it's great, we've got this absolutely terrific plan. And I said, okay, so what are you doing with it? Oh, we do this and we do that. We have these Indigenous subjects and we have these subjects taught by Indigenous people. And I said, so all of this is happening. And they said, what? And I said, well, it's happening. We've got a plan. And they said, oh, no, it's not actually happening. We haven't implemented it. We think it would be a good idea if we did. So the question is, you can have the best plan in the world, but if you're not actually going to do it, you've got a problem. And I think there are a lot of quite technical things. For example, if you're going to have Indigenous people teaching nothing but subjects that are directly related to Indigenous people, they're going to be marginalised. It's going to be really, really easy to intellectually discount what they're doing. So you really, if you're committed to it, you have to think, how are we going to have Indigenous subjects taught by Indigenous people? But how are we going to have Indigenous people teaching with authority, alongside and with their colleagues? And I think that's a real challenge. I think student support is an enormous challenge. I mean, I remember the bad old days in universities where we would literally import Aboriginal people on scholarships and just let them run. And, you know, it was like a casualty rate rather than a pass rate. I think that's changed, and I think that that's very important. I think, you know, we have alumni awards, and in fact, I think I'm right in saying Charlize won one of our alumni awards. And the work she does with midwifery is just absolutely extraordinary as an outcome. What I always say at those alumni awards is that at the university that I spent most of my life teaching and researching at, the person who would have won the alumni award would have been the person who wrote the book about what she was doing, rather than the person who did it. And I think we've really got to interrogate ourselves as universities about that, those sort of things. What do we put value on, and what do we see as an outcome? And I think that's a challenge. I noted that Doseena said we're doing okay at ACU, sort of, so I've written that down.
I love ACU.
I will hold that forever. But I think there'd be no university in Australia that could possibly honestly say, yeah, we've got this, we've nailed it. And I think that's a real challenge.
Well, that is a nice segue to Doseena. Are there new initiatives we need to consider in this space? Your idea of two rivers coming into one. Are there new initiatives around real and active cultural sharing that we should consider? I mean, do languages matter in this space?
Yeah, I think languages is really important. And I think on each campus there should be something done according to country that you're on and learning some languages. Good example is that we go across the sea and go to Aotearoa. And you ask any Pākehā and they know Maori language. So why can't we start that in universities? But, you know, I'm also realistic. We do a lot at the university and there's not much space to do anything else. Another project that I'm on at the moment is to try and recruit and retain postgraduate students. And I hope that will continue. But that's one way in which we could help the leadership out there in the workplace with postgrad alumni. And also bring in academics, Indigenous academics. And you're right, Greg. You know, I get extremely emotional, and if you ask every Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person in this room, when they lecture, we get emotionally drained when we talk about our own history. And I don't think people realise just how much we get drained. And another thing too is that we go through terrible bereavement. Richard and I know my relative, he's had 45 deaths since August. How do you cope with that? And their immediate families. Ask the Indigenous academic, who also has to talk about their Aboriginal history, and the massacres, and all the bad stuff. The people, these lovely 19, how old are they when they come to 19, 20-year-olds? You know, white-eyed bushy tailed kids are not aware of. So the challenge for our academics is immense. Now, I don't discount the fact that it's hard work, I think, changing our academics, their mindsets to grapple with that and creatively lecture and put into practice some of our things. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, you were spot on. And not only did you touch on education, but also community, I think, and the support the community gives. Your Grace, you are a renowned scholar as well as a spiritual leader. What is the role of education in building viable communities of shared interests with our First Peoples in Australia?
The question of education is crucial, but listening to some of the discussion, I've been wondering whether there is also a crucial question about the model of education, or even the model of history. What does the telling of history involve? You see, Western history depends absolutely upon monumental evidence and written evidence. Now, clearly, to tell anything like a true history of Indigenous Australia, you couldn't really rely upon either. And even the whole notion of history, as I'm articulating it, is profoundly Western. So that I fear, in some sense, that in our schools and universities, the model of education is not, and as it is, cannot be, what Doseena described as a culturally safe space. Again, I raise the question of what closing the gap does mean. Who has to come to whom? Doseena, you said that academics have to begin to think differently. I agree with that. You see, the question of language is more complex than it seems too. I was at Rockhampton today, where Aunty Nikki, I didn't get her surname, but she gave the most remarkable welcome to country. Joan was there and heard it. It was very moving, in fact. It was quite long. but it was fascinating and moving. Now, she began by speaking very fluently her Indigenous language at the start, and then she moved into English. But at one point I thought to myself, even though she's speaking English, she's still speaking another language that we struggle to understand. I think it is fascinating, as you said, Doseena, that we of white Australia, if I could use that expression, we have never made any real attempt to learn Indigenous languages. Now, there are a lot of them, and not all of them are recorded, I'm told. But that, and I've been a bit of a linguist through life. I've learned all kinds of European languages, but I've never had the slightest interest in learning an Indigenous language. And that puzzles me, and I think is a symptom of the challenge we're facing. I do think language is important, but also the capacity to listen. And this has simmered through the whole discussion, that we have never learned, I think, to listen to each other. At least those with the power and the money have been saying to Indigenous Australians, you listen to us. But they have never really attempted to listen to Indigenous Australia, and it's hard to do it. And I think there's a fear with regard to the voice to Parliament, a fear of having to listen in a new way to the Indigenous voices and what that might mean and where it might lead. But I think until we all learn, this is solidarity, learn a new kind of listen to each other. And I don't know how this is going to happen, but it has to happen. I think a lot of the other stuff is going to be kind of not quite cosmetic, but it won't go to the core of the whole problem. And that's where education has to somehow look, is to the core of the problem and not just dealing with symptoms, however acute.
Thank you, Your Grace. I mean, Richie, new models of education, can you share with us your experience of that in your area? What's worked, what hasn't worked, what have you learned?
This is a pet subject of mine, education. A few years ago, my esteemed friend, Mr. Noel Pearson, took a delegation over to America to meet some American school teachers in a program known as DI, Direct Instructions. Now, the schools in Cape York, before then, would have been 4 or 5 years behind the schools at certain grades down south. Because in a way, nobody really understands. Mothers and fathers in Cape York, they want their child to be scholars, but they're not given the opportunity. So anyway, Mr. Pearson went to America. He met some American teachers in a couple of programs, and he boarded back. And he brought the American school teachers with him to actually teach our school teachers how to deliver DI. I think it was implemented for about a year, and then I went up to Arakoon, and it was implemented in 4 schools. Arakoon, Hopevale, Cowan, and in part, Mossman Gorge, the Mossman community. I went up about 12 months after it was implemented in Arakoon. And being an Indigenous person, when you stand in the classroom, there would have been 12 to 15 students in grade 1. The next room was grade 2. And you have one school teacher, obviously a white school teacher, that's not being disrespectful. Then you might have 2 mothers from the community and their children are in the class. And when I saw this direct instructions being taught to the kids, I said to no, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, because I've never seen Indigenous children so competitive in a classroom. They were actually pushing one another to put their arms up, to answer the question, the teacher to ask them the question. And it was mind-boggling for me, it really was. And even today, I think this is a big family. This is a big family in this room on Indigenous issues in this country. If any one of you I would strongly recommend, if any one of you, yourself, Archbishop, Greg, Mr. Button, my niece, if you had the opportunity to go to Arakoon, well, not Arakoon, Hopevale, because it's closest to kids, and you saw direct instructions taught in that school, you would think, wow, where are we? Because after a year of being taught direct instructions, and no child gets left behind under DI, not one child gets left behind. If they lack, the teacher makes time to go to bring that student up to the same degree as the other school children. I think every single child in this country, whatever color, has to be taught education. Because, you know, if you don't have education, my father used to say to me, if you don't have education, you'll be standing on the side of the road with the sign that says, slow, go. All right? And it doesn't give you much self-esteem being in a position like that. Some people, obviously, in the early days, they didn't get the opportunity. But now we have the opportunity for every child in this country. And I think education, as Australians, we have to demand that our children get the best education whatsoever.
Thank you, Richie. Education makes justice possible. I'd like to pick up on a comment Cherise made earlier. The Adam Goods documentary, The Final Quarter, which went to early this month, detailed the last 3 years of the Australian of the Year's AFL career. The American academic Rupert Nacoste has coined the evocative phrase hibernating racism, arguing that all of us are susceptible to this phenomenon that raises its head when we choose to build on historical divisions rather than cohesion. Is this part of the challenge that Adam Goods faced in his final quarter? And if so, how can we stand in solidarity with him? Anybody like Greg?
Well, it's interesting and it's complex. I've been on quite a journey with the Adam Goods stuff. So the thing you've got to understand is I'm a Victorian and I'm a football aristocrat. So I barracked for Carlton, which is God's team. My great-grand-uncle was captain coach of Geelong.
I have to say I agree with you.
Yeah, it's true. God loves Carlton. That's why he tests us from time to time. But my father was a very famous football journalist in Melbourne, John Craven. So we were sort of professionals. And I've never booed anyone at the football in my life because, to my father, it was a professional discourtesy. We were the only people in the crowd, my sister and I, who would actually humiliate ourselves by clapping the umpires on. So, we were not really into it. My favourite footballer as a boy was a wonderful man called Sidney Jackson, who was a proud Noongar man from Western Australia. And what Sid Jackson took was unbelievable. I mean, it was just terrible in the 70s. He actually developed a way of dealing it, which was he decided that whenever they called him something like that, he'd just punch them out. Then some of the Collingwood guys, being filth, realised that what they could do was they could go and stand next to the umpire and say something racist. And Sid thought about it and he could punch them out and he'd get thrown out for a couple of weeks, but it was a lot better than putting up with it. Now, the interesting thing with Adam Goods was, I never warmed to Adam Goods as a footballer. This is just totally neutral stuff. Because I did think he staged for free kicks. Kevin Bartlett, of course, was the greatest stager of free kicks ever. So whatever poor old Adam did, he never managed that. And I used to wonder, okay, this is booing, it's getting worse. And people were starting to talk about it as if it was racist. And I thought, is it because he stages for free kicks? Or is it because he's an Indigenous man? And the conclusion that I came to was that the one thing you couldn't avoid accepting was that he was being treated so terribly if he was a stager because he was an Indigenous state. That on whatever analysis you took of Adam Goods' style football, there was a deeply, deeply problematic race element to it. And the thing that really sort of makes me wonder about this, we have an Indigenous round in the AFL. Everybody loves it. Everybody goes there. People buy the Guernseys, and yet I suspect that the same people who buy the Guernseys and cheer at the game are the people who boo Adam Goodes. And it really makes you wonder about how you deal with this, because shallow marketing equality is not going to do it. You're not going to get a group of public relations consultants to solve this. I think the Archbishop's right that there has to be a deep listening on both sides. So I find the Goodes thing hugely confronting at all sorts of levels, but probably that's on the level I find most confronting.
Thank you for that. Selwyn, do you want to comment on?
Look, I think the starting to me in the entire African story. I'm a rugby union.
That's all right.
I'm a footballer here. I'm feeling out of it.
What came out of the documentary for me was really about the change in the public narrative by the public commentators. Because all of the things that the public commentators were talking about and the way that they changed the story to suit themselves and to suit what the public wanted to hear was completely different from reality. All of the things that they'd said Adam had done to that young girl, and Adam had done in terms of his own battles and everything else, he had been doing those things the entire time. He was the one leading the charge and having the conversations to say, we need to protect that girl. It's not her fault for what she's done. It's something that's come out of the home. It's the parents that have influenced her. We've got to protect that young girl. But the public commentators changed the entire narrative for them to actually convince the public that it was Adam that had attacked that girl, and Adam was continuing to attack that girl. So that to me was remarkable in the story. That no one else was stepping up to the mark to challenge the public commentators to say, hang on, that's not the right story here. You've created your own anchor points. And so that was the significant shift that I saw.
Very helpful, I think. So, are there other comments other panelists would want to make on this particular topic?
When I went around the world on my Churchill Fellowship, one of the things the Indigenous nation elders were saying is that forgiveness, to bring healing to this nation, there needs to be forgiveness. And I do agree with you, Mark, in terms of the spiritual aspect. I think being a Jesus follower, he is an example, and the church is multicultural. But I think forgiveness and following his ways. I was a missionary in Papua New Guinea, and before I came back to Australia, I was given a vision. Now that's one thing that and dreams. That's really common for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. And my dream and my vision was this. I saw Australia, a flat Australia, flattened out. And around the cities, there were black knights in shining armours with their big black plumes, and there was obviously wind, very strong on black horses, like the Frisian black horses, the Zorros, and they were mounted, and they were all on the city. And I said, they're the armies of the evil one. And lo and behold, there was a light coming up from Uluru, and out of that light came a cross. And I think the Lord was showing me that the healing of Australia won't actually come from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, folks.
I think Doseena is right. And it's partly what I mean when I say we have to rethink what we mean by closing the chapter. Who has to catch up with who? We've also got to reckon with our DNA. When the first Europeans settled here, they found the Indigenous peoples a serious and aggressive and dangerous competitor. This was a small and very vulnerable community that was more than a touch paranoid, the early white settlement of Eastern Australia. And we have never been able to imagine a future where everyone flourishes. We just haven't been able or even wanted to do it. But solidarity surely means that. I think part of the I agree with Greg that the Adam Goods thing has got layer upon layer upon layer. But part of it was some people, and I certainly wouldn't have barracked for Sydney, but some people, that they resented Goods for being the magnificent player that he was. I mean, he's a fantastic footballer, whatever the colour of his skin. But he just happened to be Indigenous. And how dare you be the player that you are and responsible for beating my team? We couldn't imagine a world where everyone is allowed to flourish. We've never escaped from that world of us versus them. For us to succeed, we the whiteys from the beginning, we had to put the black fella down, or get rid of the black fella. But the only way forward, beyond the running sewer, I think, is for us to kind of reimagine an Australia where everyone flourishes. The Indigenous, the whiteys like me, but also newer arrivals. And get beyond us versus them in a world where us versus them is becoming more powerful and widespread.
Thank you, Grace. Richie, do you want to add anything else before we move on to the final question tonight on the conversation so far?
Look, I think, and I can just about say, every Indigenous person in this room has been subject to some sort of racism. And I think it's because there is no education or educating from the parents or the grandparents about these people. We're all the same people, you know. I've been humbled at some shops that I've gone into, and I've stood there for 10 minutes. And it's not a reflection on us and them. It's not, I just think in the mindset of some people, you know, well, he's a parky, so he won't have any money. And you know, I can just about swear on the Bible that that's the way some people think. That is the way some people think, you know. He won't be able to afford this, she won't be able to afford that. And so it's a mindset, and the mindset's got to change completely around.
That's very good, Richie. Panelists, we have time for one last question, and it is this. We have heard some positive comments this evening. However, we've heard some real challenges as well. Given the sheer scale and complexity of the shared agenda and task at hand, where do you find your optimism, Your Grace?
The sheer resilience of the Indigenous peoples. The capacity to sing the songs and tell the stories and to cling against all the odds and with all the hassles, their capacity to endure. It's almost a miracle, I think. I'm not an optimist. Optimism is a bit glib. What gives me hope is the kind of resilience and resourcefulness I've seen in Indigenous people. And also the goodwill from others. I think there is goodwill, accompanied by undercurrents of at times astonishing racism. But by and large, the source of hope for me is the resilience and the resourcefulness of our Indigenous peoples.
Doseena?
All the good news stories, the strong stories, that's what that gives me hope, that they will just accelerate, build up.
Great.
Well, I mean, I'm a natural Irish pessimist. On this, I do have a certain optimism because I actually think most people are good and they actually want to do the right thing if they can be given the chance to do it. And in this context, and I'm thinking particularly of the Indigenous voice, I think if we're humble enough to explain it, then I think it's persuadable. And I know really well how easy it is to lose referenda because I was Malcolm Turnbull's deputy on the Republican referenda on the yes side. So you can thank me personally for the British monarchy. Malcolm and I did that brilliantly. But I mean, I think there's enough reason for optimism already, and I mean, there are two examples that I'd give. I mean, I can remember, years ago when sort of Noel and Julie and Lisa, our Liberal MP, and I, and Aunty, another conservative constitutional scholar. Now, if you get that sort of goodwill, and I mean, when I look at the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and I think of all of those people, all of those different perspectives, all of those different views, and when Alfred Deakin was asked, how did you manage to pull off federation? He burst into tears and said it was a miracle. Now, in a sense, I look at that and I think there are a lot of miracles out there. You just have to put yourself in the way of them. And one thing is absolutely certain, we are not going to get anywhere by being pessimistic.
Selwyn, I'm forever an optimist. So I'm a little bit different from my fellow panelists. But I see optimism in the room. I see optimism in my dinner date tonight with my daughter. But I want to posit something for people in the sense of thinking about where we go from here. Because I'm a believer in what might eventuate through the creation of this. But what I want you to do is to take away two things. Remove two things from your psyche in the sense of where it's connected at the moment. The first one is this whole notion of the third chamber. Just forget the third chamber completely. The second one I want you to forget is ATSIC. Because what we're doing is we're connecting the thing that we want, the stuff that leaves a bad taste in the Australian mouth. So we can't continue to connect something that we want to be successful with stuff that people already connect failure to. So we've got to get rid of it. We've got to take it out of our psyche. We've got to take it out of the commentary, take it out of the language and the narrative that we're talking about already when we're wanting to progress to a voice. But I also want you to think about what's possible for the voice, and what are things that already exist that the voice might look like. And for those who've been involved in public service and in the bureaucracy and in politics for long periods of time, we already have things that are very similar to the voice. And we already have things that have Indigenous people on them providing advice to Parliament. They're called parliamentary committees. They're in existence. They provide advice. They review legislation. They have debates with Parliament. They actually run inquiries. They take public submissions. This is no different from what the voice function is being described to look like. But we haven't actually posited that in the nation's psyche about what are we connected to that people are comfortable with. So I want you to think about the parliamentary committee processes we already have and think about that being the potential for the voice, because that is not something that's a challenge and it's not confronting to politicians.
Thank you, Selwyn. Richie, you joined us at a moment's notice. We will give you the final word for this evening.
Thanks, I think constitutional recognition and the Indigenous voice. About 4 months ago, BHP, Rio Tinto, announced their support for a constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians, and they funded that program. All right? I think in the budget papers this year, they put aside $7.5 million to work on constitutional recognition in the referendum. Since then, Judge Gleeson's come out, Judge French, every other conservative that I know have come out. And they're saying, I guess they're speaking from their heart, let's do this. I just said to Greg tonight, we all go on holidays, some of us go overseas, we can afford to go overseas. The last thing we say before we leave that country is, I can't wait to get home. Australia is our home for all of us, all right? When you get home, you think to yourself, wow, it's great to be back here. This is the greatest country, this is the great country. But if we do the constitutional recognition, we create the voice, we change the constitution, this will be the greatest ever country in the world.